On what seemed like a normal morning, May Harper woke up earlier than usual. A quiet breeze from the coast was blowing through the slightly ajar window, bringing the brackish smell of the sea and wet rocks. She stood up, threw on a woolen cardigan, and walked around the house, an old 18th century building that she and her husband had turned into a boutique hotel. Every morning in their lives began with rituals. He brewed coffee, she checked reservations and left fresh scones at the counter. But that day was different. He wasn't in the kitchen. The room was quiet. Too quiet. May thought at first that he was just lingering in the shower room, or had decided to go outside, to check the parking lot or talk to the gardener. But the longer she was alone, the heavier it became in her chest. She went upstairs to their bedroom and immediately realized something had gone wrong. Her husband lay in bed, unnaturally still, his face pale with each passing second, as if the light was leaving him. Everything else happened in semi-blurred actions. The call to the ambulance, the futile attempts to do something, the arrival of the doctors, a brief "we're sorry," and emptiness. Her husband, Ethan Harper, died of a heart attack at the age of 41. Yesterday they'd discussed the spring menu update at the hotel restaurant, and today he was no longer breathing. May couldn't believe it. He'd been active, almost never sick, made plans for a vacation in Scotland. But now all those plans were cut short. It was as if everything around her had frozen. Not a sound, not a movement, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath with her. For the next few hours, May was in a near stupor. She mechanically notified the manager, asked to postpone reservations, told the staff to take the day off. People started calling. Neighbors came by with flowers, leaving them at the door. But it all seemed fake to her, like it was happening to someone else. She walked through the rooms where everything reminded her of him. His coat at the front door, his notebook on the front desk, the cup on the shelf with the rest of her morning tea. Everything reminded her of him and at the same time painfully emphasized his absence. By evening, she was alone in the house. Their son, 9-year-old Jamie, was with a babysitter whom she urgently asked to pick him up, not knowing how to explain to him that his father was gone. She just couldn't. Everything inside her was tearing up, but all that came out was endless fatigue and deafening silence. Later, she went up to the second floor and stopped at the window of their bedroom. From here, there was a view of the garden and further out to the vast sea. This picture, which usually filled her with peace, now seemed frighteningly indifferent. Nature did not notice the loss. The waves continued to roll in. The wind chased the clouds. The seagulls shouted in the distance, as if nothing had happened. Everything went on as if Ethan's death was just a minor scratch on the surface of the general flow of life. It was only inside her that everything stopped. She realized it when she sat down on the edge of the bed and noticed the clock on the bedside table had stopped going. Their hands froze at 6:48, almost exactly the time the doctor said his heart had stopped. The battery may have simply died, but it became a symbol for her. Time had stopped the minute he was gone, and now everything she knew seemed unimportant. Their shared business, the hotel, the restaurant, the expansion plans, all lost meaning. But worst of all was the realization that not only would she have to cope with the loss ahead of her, but she'd have to decide how to move on with her life. Not for herself, for Jamie, for the memory of Ethan, for the people who trusted them and their business. But on this night, in this empty room with the frozen clock, May felt only one thing, a loneliness she'd never known before, and fear not of him being dead, but of how she would live alone now. Cold visits and warm words about nothing. The day after Ethan's death, May awoke not to the sound of her alarm clock, but to the fact that everything was too quiet. The house no longer made the usual sounds. No rattling of dishes from the kitchen, no husband's voice echoing through the staff, no smell of coffee. It was as if everything had been scrubbed out of the air. Only the gray morning haze outside the window reminded her that the world continued to turn, despite her personal catastrophe. Soon the first relatives began to arrive, not the ones she had expected in the first place, but the ones who usually showed up for the holidays, holding gifts and phrases rehearsed in the car beforehand. The first was her younger sister Lauren and her husband, arriving an hour and a half late. Lauren had a mask of sympathy on her face, but her eyes were tired and irritated, as if this had all interfered with her carefully planned life. Their parents arrived behind them, no longer young, with the same frozen facial expressions worn at funerals. Ample austerity, slight grief, no genuine involvement. Her mother put her cold arms around May and began to talk about how hard it was to go through all this, remembering her youth and her uncle, who had died in the 90s. May was mentioned in passing. Jamie was not mentioned at all. The grief she carried within her was so dense that it seemed physically tangible. Her body seemed to resist every movement, and words, even the simplest ones, were difficult to say. But she had to receive the guests, as if it were all a normal hotel reception, only without reservations. Some of them behaved with restraint, trying not to look into her eyes. Others spoke with mechanical politeness, throwing standard phrases that did not require a response. No one had words that truly related to what had happened, perhaps because such words did not exist. At one point she heard her father in the hallway discussing with his son-in-law how much the hotel building might be worth if put up for sale in a quick offer situation. Those words hit her like a slap in the face. It seemed that Ethan's death was not a reason for them to empathize, but a reason for them to calculate. None of them had offered to stay to help with Jamie, hadn't asked if she needed help running the hotel, even though they knew she was alone, both as a mother and a manager. They discussed how hard it would be for her to run the business without male support, as if her past efforts meant nothing. When evening came and the guests began to leave, May had no strength left even to cry. She stood at the window, watching the cars drive out of her yard. Each one took with it another piece of her belief that family was a pillar. Plates of unfinished food and glasses of wine she hadn't even tasted were left on the table. Her father promised to return the following week to discuss some practical matters. Her sister said she was sorry and added that she and her husband would not cancel their vacation since the tickets were non-refundable. Her mother, before she left, asked if she should think about selling the restaurant because it would be too hard for you to carry everything on your shoulders. Once again the house was silent. Jamie was asleep. The staff had dispersed. Outside, the wind swayed the old hotel sign. May walked through the empty rooms and caught herself thinking that everything around her felt like it was waiting for her to break. But she couldn't afford it. Tomorrow she'd have to open the breakfast kitchen, greet guests, make sure business didn't stand up. Had to think about the future, even though every inner impulse of hers said the future was over. She realized one thing. Things would be different from now on. Not just because of the loss of Ethan, but because of how her family had reacted. Not as supportive, but as concerned observers, ready to act at their convenience. Their warm words had left a cold residue, and she felt even more alone now than she had the day he died. Something new began to stir inside her. It wasn't healing or calm, but a quiet, stubborn resistance. No matter what they planned, she wouldn't give up what they'd built with Ethan. Not for money, not for fake care. The inheritance they've been waiting for it had been a week since the funeral. May seemed to herself like a blank wall with something banging against it relentlessly. Calls, paperwork, logistics, reports, purchases. Life went on, but without flavor. Every movement became mechanical, as if she was handling things, not because she wanted to, but because she had no right not to. There was no pause in her and Ethan's business. Guests were still arriving. Reservations were still coming in. Vendors were waiting to be paid, and the restaurant needed daily attention. There were a lot of people at the funeral, regular customers, vendors, old acquaintances, but it was after the funeral that the visits that May had been looking forward to with tension began. Her parents came again, now with the clear intention of talking not about pain but about papers. They brought with them a briefcase, a notebook, and confident facial expressions. Her mother mentioned from the doorstep that they should just sit down and discuss things calmly, as if it were about planning a holiday party, not the aftermath of her husband's death. They were interested in everything, without hiding it. What bills remained? Were there any debts? Had the paperwork for the building been finalized? What about the business? Who was in charge now? Who had access to the bank accounts? The questions came one after another. May tried to answer with restraint at first, then became increasingly withdrawn. She realized where this was going. Their interest wasn't in her well-being or Jamie's. They wanted to find out what kind of inheritance they might get, or at least what they could influence. A couple days later, a letter arrived from the lawyer she and Ethan had once drafted a will with. He said Ethan had drawn up the will shortly before his death and invited May to a meeting for a formal reading. She remembered her husband bringing it up a few months ago. She'd brushed it off then. They were young. Why think about such a thing? But he'd insisted, and she'd signed the papers without getting into the details. Now these papers became a shield. At the meeting, the lawyer read the text with a smooth, professional tone, but every word sounded to her like confirmation that Ethan had thought of everything. He'd left the entire business, building, accounts, and personal savings to May and their son. He'd also provided for a trust fund for Jamie until he came of age, and then a separate amount available only for his education. Everything was clear, no loopholes. No one but her and their son had rights to what she and Ethan had spent years creating. Leaving the lawyer's office, May felt both relief and foreboding. She knew. This letter was like the firing of a starter's pistol. Relatives wouldn't back down. Not like her parents, especially her father, a man who had spent his life judging the world by money and influence. Confirmation of her fears came the next day. Her parents showed up again, accompanied by Uncle Henry, an old insurance broker who just wanted to do some consulting. They began to have a conversation about the future, about the complexities of a business without a man at the helm, about how she couldn't do it alone, about how it might be wise to delegate some of the assets to the family, so as not to lose everything, as they put it. Underneath this pretense lurked the obvious goal of getting a share. Dad mentioned that we're family after all, and that Ethan wouldn't want you to be alone with this. May watched them and felt something inside her grow harder, colder. Everything they said was calibrated, disguised as caring, but there was an impatient greed glinting in her mother's eyes, and her uncle was poring over folders as if looking for the right moment to make a leap. Later, when they left, she sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, surrounded by papers, letters, delivery schedules. On the wall hung a sign that read the words she and Ethan had made up years ago. Welcome home. And now more than ever, those words seemed false to her. Because the real home, the one with warmth, support, love, was gone with him. What was left was a shell. And that shell had begun to be infiltrated by people she'd once considered close. But worst of all was the realization that they'd been waiting for this. It was as if her husband's death had become a window of opportunity for them. Ethan was gone, and they decided it was their time. Perhaps some of them even wondered mentally, why not sooner? May realized if she didn't start acting, they'd tear up whatever was left. They wouldn't just leave. Their interest in the legacy wasn't random. They felt no guilt or pity, only entitlement. The right to get a share, to seize the moment, to push if need be, all under the guise of family decisions. Now it was not only a fight for her husband's memory, but for her own independence, for their son, for their common cause. And that fight was just beginning. The note in the desk drawer. 2 days had passed since her parents' last visit, but the tension in the house had not subsided. May couldn't relax for a moment. Every movement through the hotel was accompanied by a sense of anxiety, as if someone was watching her or preparing their next move. She tried to go about her business as usual, checking in guests, overseeing bookings, supervising the kitchen, but the same words kept spinning in her head. You can't handle this alone. You have to share. It's in the family's best interest. Her father hadn't called, but that didn't mean he had given up. May knew he was just gathering information, consulting, preparing his next step. She could feel it in her bones. So when she once again found herself alone in Ethan's office, She didn't just sit down to review the accounts. She began searching, at first subconsciously, then deliberately. She rifled through drawers, opened folders, scanned notes and documents, hoping to find some sort of support he might have left behind. And she found it. A slim, brown envelope with no markings, tucked between two old notebooks. Her name was written on it in Ethan's familiar, slightly careless handwriting. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. It was a letter. He had written it about 3 months earlier, judging by the date in the corner. Ethan was speaking to her directly, not as a business partner or hotel colleague, but as a husband and a man who had sensed he might not live to old age. He wrote that he had felt the first signs of discomfort, but didn't want to scare her, especially in the middle of the season. He mentioned seeing a doctor, being advised to monitor his heart, but decided it wasn't time to panic. Still, deep down, he admitted, something told him to be prepared. May read every line as if holding a voice from beyond the grave. Ethan wrote that he had revised his will, updated his insurance policy, and left instructions with his lawyer. But the main reason for the letter wasn't legal. It was personal. He warned her about her father, about how he had tried twice to involve Ethan in shady schemes, once in real estate, another time in a supposed gourmet franchise managed by an acquaintance. Both times Ethan refused, but her father hadn't taken it as a final no. He was convinced he could get access through his daughter if something happened. Ethan asked her to be careful. He knew May always tried to maintain a relationship with her family, despite their complexities. But he insisted, this time, the stakes were too high. He emphasized that everything they had built belonged to her and Jamie, not for profit, but to preserve the memory and provide a stable future for their son. He wrote that money can corrupt people, especially those who are used to relying on others. And if May's parents started pushing, she had to protect what was theirs. The letter ended with words of love and faith. He believed in her strength, in her ability to be a pillar for their son, in her capacity to weather any storm. This was more than a testament. It was a shield, addressed not to a lawyer, but to her heart. When she finished reading, her eyes were dry, though her throat was tight with pain. A new feeling took root inside her. Not just grief for Ethan, but a clear, crystalline awareness. He had known what would happen. He knew what her family was capable of, and he had prepared her, not with facts, but with confidence, not with instructions, but with trust. May carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, then locked it in the safe with the important documents. From that moment on, everything changed. She now had not only the emotional right, but also the moral foundation to resist their pressure. She no longer feared their next visit. There were no more doubts, no more hope that things could still become truly family. This was now a confrontation, calm, calculated, but resolute. Not over assets, not over business, but over dignity. To protect for Jamie what his father left not just in numbers on paper, but in an example. How to defend what's yours when the whole world tries to take it away. Family council, or secret trial. May knew they would come again. It was only a matter of time. Her father wasn't someone who gave up after a single refusal. He was used to getting his way, not through force, but through persistence, pressure, manipulation, cloaked as care. 4 days after she found Ethan's letter, he called with a proposal to hold a family council. He said everything needed to be discussed openly, like adults, not in passing. He suggested meeting at her hotel, on neutral ground. Her parents would come, Lauren, Uncle Henry, maybe even some cousins. His voice carried that same business tone he reserved for negotiations or lease agreements. May agreed, not because she wanted to talk, but because she was ready. She didn't feel fear, only cold focus. Ethan's letter had given her the inner core she had lacked before. Now she saw everything clearly, not as a daughter or daughter-in-law, but as a hostess, a mother, a person from whom others were trying to steal the right to her own life. They arrived on a weekend. From early morning, the house was silent, disturbed only by May's footsteps and the staff's voices. She had sent Jamie to a friend's house, explaining she had an important conversation with adults. She didn't want him to hear another act of pressure disguised as a lecture on family duty. By 2 in the afternoon, everyone was gathered in the hotel's guest lounge. Her mother wore a dark blue dress and the expression of weary sorrow. Her father showed up in his favorite plaid shirt, a thick folder in hand. Lauren had her eyes glued to her phone. Uncle Henry wore a suit, a clear sign he was here not as family, but as a man of business. Behind him were Aunt Martha and Cousin Jason, rarely present at family events, now seemingly recruited as reinforcements. May greeted them calmly and led them into the room usually reserved for investor meetings. Spacious, with windows facing the garden, an oval table, tea and cookies on a tray. The air was tense, like before a storm. Her father started the conversation. His speech was rehearsed. He spoke of Ethan's loss, of how everything had changed, how hard it was for May now, how important it was for the family to unite. But within minutes, the tone became more pragmatic. He began discussing the business, its directionless structure, and how everything was tied to one person, now gone. Her mother backed him up, noting how hard it was to manage the restaurant, handle bookings, and oversee staff. Then, as if on cue, Uncle Henry stepped in. With printouts and charts, he proposed a plan to divide business responsibilities, redistribute resources, form a management board consisting of May, her father, and himself, all under the pretext that May was a woman, a mother, and it was too much for her. When May didn't respond, Lauren took the floor. She spoke about fairness, how Ethan had been part of the family, how the business was a joint effort since their parents had helped with loans, paperwork, licenses. Then Aunt Martha chimed in, suggesting it might be time to rethink ownership shares, to protect everyone from risks and keep the hotel within the family, rather than on one woman's shoulders. May listened. No one mentioned Jamie. No one asked how she was coping. They only cared about structure, capital, legal loopholes. Everything was aimed at one goal: to gain access to a business they had never built, but now believed was their right. In their eyes, she saw no compassion, only hunger. Hunger for power, for control, for profit. When her father handed her the folder of printed proposals, she didn't take it. Instead, she stood and looked around the room. She remembered how she and Ethan had built the hotel, choosing every tile, every faucet, staying up late for tastings, training staff. She recalled Ethan's joy at their first positive reviews, how they celebrated their first profit. All these people had merely been spectators. They came to the hotel like visitors, just to eat, chat, take pictures. They never stood at the stove, never handled supplies, never repaid loans. But now they wanted to be co-owners. May realized she was alone in that room, but stronger than all of them. Her solitude wasn't a weakness. It was a clear space where no one dictated the rules. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply turned and left, leaving them with their plans and charts. On her way out, she said only one thing: that all business decisions were hers as the sole owner, and that she did not wish to have further such discussions. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. They hadn't expected a refusal. They weren't prepared for a firm no. But it had been said, and it marked the beginning of the end of their attempts. Late that evening, May sat alone in the quiet restaurant, among empty tables. It was drizzling outside, with only one lamp glowing inside. She didn't feel victorious. She felt free. She knew resentment would follow, pressure, perhaps even legal steps. But now she had the most important thing: clarity. Clarity about who everyone truly was, and the resolve to stand her ground no matter what. The hotel they saved. After the day May rejected the family council, much had changed, though outwardly everything looked the same. The same walls, the same rooms, the same windows overlooking the sea. But something inside her had shifted. deeply and irreversibly. She no longer waited for calls from her parents, no longer sought support from her sister, and no longer hoped for reconciliation. Instead, she immersed herself fully in the business she had once built with Ethan, now on her own. At first it was tough. Her parents didn't call. Lauren removed her from the family chat. Aunt Martha posted a cryptic message online about people who forget who helped them in the beginning. But May no longer reacted. Instead, she conducted inventory, reviewed contracts, fired lazy staff, and hired new, energetic, loyal ones. The hotel didn't just need support, it needed a second wind, and she became that wind. Each morning began with tasks: inspecting the kitchen, checking rooms, replying to emails, handling bookings. In the evenings, reviewing reports, planning purchases, reading guest reviews. Sometimes she was exhausted to the core, but it was a different kind of tiredness. Not from helplessness, but from momentum. Jamie began spending more time with her, helping in the kitchen, folding napkins, bringing fruit for breakfast. He didn't ask many questions, but May sometimes caught his gaze, attentive, mature beyond his years. In it, she saw understanding. He knew it was just the two of them now, but that was enough. Weeks passed. Guests began returning. Regulars noticed the changes and praised the improved service. The restaurant began to revive. One of the chefs suggested updating the menu, and May agreed. She was no longer afraid of change. On the contrary, she sought it. Now that everything rested on her, each step was her decision. One day, she opened an old attic drawer where Ethan had kept personal things: photos, notebooks, vintage menus, early contracts. Among them, she found a small wooden sign they had ordered before opening the hotel. It read, "Harper's Haven, a place to return to yourself." Back then, it seemed like just a nice marketing slogan. Now it had become the truth. May decided to hang the sign in the lobby, not for the guests, but for herself. So every time she walked past, she would remember why it all began. Not for money, not for status, but for peace, comfort, and simple human warmth. For what she had once found with Ethan, and now protected alone. On the day that marked exactly 2 months since her husband's death, she gathered the staff and spoke a few simple words. No grand speeches, just gratitude for staying, for believing, for continuing. She didn't call herself the owner. She called everyone a part of the same mission. From that moment, things truly changed. The staff began working with a different spirit. There were more smiles, more initiative, more unity. That evening, May sat on the veranda, wrapped in a wool blanket, holding a cup of tea. Jamie sat nearby reading, staring out the window. The sun slowly sank beyond the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and copper. In that simple moment, there was no drama, no struggle, only peace. She knew many trials still lay ahead. Her relatives might try to come back. Legal questions might arise. But now she had clarity. The hotel remained hers. Not because it was legally in her name, but because she had saved it. She had let no one destroy what had been built with love, built on trust, on shared breakfasts, on her son's laughter in the hallway. Late at night, walking down the corridor, she paused at the door of the room Ethan once used when they were just starting out. The door was closed, but inside she felt calm. Not sadness. Calm, as if he was still there. Not in voices or shadows, but in the very air, in the creaking floorboards, in the flickering of the lamp. May smiled. For the first time in a long while, genuinely, she knew she had made it. Not defeated anyone, but preserved herself, preserved them. And the hotel had become not just a business, but a home. A place where her son would grow up knowing his mother never backed down. Where every morning would begin with the smell of fresh bread, not with inherited fear. And no one would ever come again to take what was not theirs.